Okay, number 23. The reasoning most closely conforms to which one of the following principles? So that means we're looking for one of these answer choices that's going to give us the principle, the reasoning, the logic that is employed by this argument. So let's read through the argument, and I think once we do, we'll have a better idea for what we should be looking for in the answer choices. We're looking for the logic behind this argument. So the argument basically says that people who drive SUVs tend to feel safer, right? They know that those cars carry less of a risk of serious injury in the event of an accident, and so therefore, since they know that the stakes are lower, since they know that if they get into an accident, it's probably not going to be as bad for them, so therefore they don't exercise as much care when they're driving. They're a little more reckless when they drive, right? Very simple logic, right? Because they know that if they do get into an accident, it won't be as bad for them. They'll feel pretty well protected, and so therefore they don't take as much precaution. They don't care so much about whether they get into an accident or not, or they don't care as much because they know that they're going to be safer in that event. And the argument continues and says, therefore, the discovery of powerful cures for certain cancers would probably also trigger an increase in behaviors such as smoking and overexposure to the sun that are known to lead to those cancers. Makes perfect sense. It's exactly the same logic, that the more we know that things are going to be okay, the more risks we feel comfortable taking, right? So when it comes to the cancers, right, the more we know that, it's okay if I get skin cancer, or if I get whatever type of cancer, right, it's okay because now there's all these powerful cures, so I'm not going to be as worried. I'm not going to avoid smoking or sun exposure as much because I know that in the event that cancer does happen, well, now there's all these powerful cures. That's the point of the paragraph, is that the more we know, the more cures that we know there are for that bad thing that might happen to us, the less careful we're going to be to avoid that thing happening to us, right? Same thing with the SUVs. Oh, it's okay if we get into an accident, we'll probably be safe, and therefore we're going to take less care, less precaution to avoid getting into an accident in the first place. So that's a very simple principle. We just want to look for an answer that points that out, that the more of a safety cushion we feel we have, the more safe we feel in the event that the bad thing happens to us, the more we know that, it's okay, even if that happens to us, we'll be okay, the less precautions we're going to take to avoid getting into that outcome to begin with. So it's a very simple principle. These answers are going to be written in a little bit of a confusing way, so we have to look for exactly that and no more and no less. So let's take a look at the answer choices and see if we can find what we're looking for. A says that when people think that there are several things they could do to reduce the risks associated with some activity, then generally they're only going to take the measure that they think is going to reduce the most risk. This doesn't match our argument, because the argument is saying that people are just not going to take any precautions at all when it comes to avoiding these cancers or accidents in an SUV. They're just going to be less cautious overall. A is saying, well, they're going to take some measures, but they're not going to take other measures. They're only going to take the measures that they think will reduce the most risk. They're not going to take the ones that will reduce the least risk, right? This paragraph doesn't differentiate. This paragraph just says people will generally just be less careful. They'll take less precautions. Not that they're going to be more selective, that they're only going to take some precautions but not others. So for example, with the cancer-inducing behaviors, smoking and overexposure to sun, it doesn't say, well, they're going to avoid smoking because that is going to prevent the most risk, but they're not going to avoid overexposure to sun because that's not going to reduce the most risk, right? It doesn't differentiate between activities and say they're only going to avoid some that reduce the most risk and not others. So that's why A doesn't really match this argument. So B is written in kind of a confusing way for some people, but it's exactly what we're looking for. B says that the development of ways to protect people from consequences of behaviors that would normally harm them, right? So if we develop ways to protect people from bad consequences of things that they could do to harm themselves, that makes them less careful to avoid those behaviors. That's exactly the logic that we've been using in this argument all along. That if we have more ways to protect ourselves from the negative consequences of our actions, we're going to be less worried. We're going to take less care to avoid those negative consequences. That applies itself in both parts of our argument, right? The SUVs, these cars that are more able to protect them in the event of an accident, makes them less careful to avoid the reckless driving that's going to cause them to get into an accident to begin with. Same thing with the cancer-inducing behaviors like smoking and overexposure to sun. So if we read that into this answer choice, B says the development of ways to protect people from the consequences of behaviors that normally would harm them. So the development of ways to protect people, that's in the paragraph, that's the discovery of powerful cures for these cancers, right? The cancers are the consequences of the behaviors such as the overexposure to sun and the smoking. So you can see we can draw a line to everything from B straight back into the argument, right? So the development, basically, if we read it into B, it sounds like the development of powerful cures to protect people from cancers, which are the consequences of smoking and overexposure to the sun, often makes people less careful to avoid smoking and overexposure to sun in the first place, right? Because they know that there's that safety cushion. They know that, oh, it's okay if they get cancer, they're going to have those cures for them anyway. So B is exactly saying the principle, the logic that we knew the whole time was the logic of the argument, which is that the more people feel like they have a safety cushion in the event that something bad happens to them, the less careful they're going to be in avoiding doing the kinds of things that are going to cause that bad thing to happen to them to begin with. So B is exactly pointing out the reasoning of the argument, and therefore it is correct. C says that people will generally take special care, special precaution to avoid behaviors that they think would likely lead to serious injury for them, but they generally don't take that much special care to avoid behaviors that they think will not harm them at all. That's a little too extreme. That doesn't match our argument, right? C just says that if they think that something won't harm them at all, then they're not going to care, right? But the argument doesn't say that. It doesn't say that they think that these things won't harm them at all. It's just that they won't harm them as much as they otherwise would have. It's not like getting into an accident in an SUV. Oh, they're just going to, get out of the car and be walking on their feet. No, they'll have a couple bruises on their arm. Maybe they just won't be in the hospital, right? Same thing with these cancers. It's not like, well, if they get cancer and these cures exist, well, that means the cancer didn't harm them at all. No, it still harmed them, right? It still made them sick with cancer, but it's just that these cures exist now, so they didn't have as much. The downside wasn't as much, right? They weren't as worried about getting into the cancer because they knew that, oh, in case I get the cancer, I'll still have cancer, but I'll be able to recover from it, right? So C is a little too extreme because C just says that people don't care about avoiding behaviors that they think will not harm them at all. No. They know that those behaviors will harm them, right? They know that the smoking and the overexposure to the sun is going to cause cancer or at least increase their risk of getting cancer. It's just that they know that there's a cure for that harm. So it's not that they don't think there's a harm. It's just that they know that, oh, even if that harm does happen, it's okay because these cures exist, right? Even if we do get into an accident in the SUV, it's okay because it won't be as bad. So that's why C is a little too extreme when it says will not harm them at all. It should really say they don't take special care to avoid behaviors that they believe will harm them in a way that they can mitigate with cures or with technology or something to that effect. So C is not going to be good to answer this question because it's too extreme. D says that people generally take more precautions when they're performing activities they know to have risky consequences versus when they're performing activities of unknown risk. So that doesn't match the paragraph, right? The argument is saying people are going to take more care when there's no cures or mitigations of the harm, right? So they're going to take more care to avoid an accident if they're not in an SUV where it's going to be more fatal. Or they're going to take more care to avoid cancer if these cures for the cancer don't exist. But if there's these things that are going to cure or mitigate the harm that might happen to them, that's when they're going to take less care. So it's not about when they know it's risky versus when it's unknown risk, right? Because in both situations in the paragraph, there is known risk, right? They know that the smoking and the overexposure to sun is potentially going to cause them to get cancer. They just know that it's okay because there's cures to that cancer, right? And they know that the driving recklessly of the SUV is going to be more likely to get them into an accident, right? How do I know that they know that? Because it's only when they're driving the SUV that they drive more carelessly. It's only when we discover the powerful cures for the cancer that they're going to say, oh, now I'm less worried about smoking and exposing myself to sun. So they know that those things are going to increase their risk of getting into that negative consequence. It's just that they know that there's these cures or ways to mitigate that negative consequence if and when it happens that makes them less careful to avoid the consequence to begin with. So it's not about knowing the risk versus not knowing the risk. It's about there being a cure or a mitigation to the negative outcome versus there not being a cure or a mitigation to the negative outcome. So D is making the wrong distinction, and therefore it doesn't match our argument. E is tricky because it kind of seems like it matches, but it doesn't match anywhere nearly as well as B does, right? E, if we read carefully, is not the same logic as the argument. E says avoiding serious harm to themselves is given a high priority by people in their behavior. So pause. So far, that already doesn't really match, right? Because we never said that avoiding serious harm is something that people give high priority to in their behavior, right? We just said that the more ways there are to mitigate the harm if and when it happens, the less care they're going to take. But that doesn't mean that without those cures that they do give high priority. They might still give low priority. It's just that they give even lower priority if they know that the cures to the cancer exist. Then they're going to care even less about overexposure to the sun and smoking. But maybe without those cures, maybe they still didn't care that much. Maybe they still didn't give it high priority, right? And then the second half of the sentence says, but avoiding lesser harms is frequently outweighed by various desires. That's also stated in a little bit too absolute of a way, because how do I know that it's frequently outweighed by various desires? Again, I just know that relative to when that harm carried more of a negative potential impact, relative to that, they cared less, right? So without the cures for the cancer, people care a little more about smoking and sun exposure. When the cures exist, they care a little bit less. But that doesn't mean that avoiding lesser harms is frequently outweighed by various desires. It just means that they're going to care a little bit less about overexposure to the sun, right? In general, it's going to trigger an increase in behaviors such as smoking and overexposure to the sun. But that doesn't mean that frequently it's going to be outweighed by various desires. It just might just be a very slight increase in those behaviors. So both parts of the sentence in E are stated in too absolute of a way to match this argument. So I think if you take a look again at B, you'll see that B matches much better because B differentiates between with the cures existing versus the cures not existing, right? B makes that distinction and points out that the more of these cures, the more of these ways to mitigate that bad consequence if and when it happens, the less people are going to care about preventing that consequence to begin with. So that's why B is a much better answer. E is incorrect. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.